He pinned Macho Man Randy Savage on national television. He traded body slams for brass knuckles. Then a wrestling star opened up a biker chapter and blew a hole in a police station. 3 deaths would trail him to his grave. His name was Ion Croitoru. In the ring, 40,000 fans screamed for Johnny K, 9, and Bruiser Bedlam. On the street, Hamilton's hardest men crossed to the other side when they saw him coming. He wrestled Hulk Hogan on live television, and 7 years later, he was a fugitive from a bombing that shattered windows for a city block. He was a Romanian immigrant's son who taught himself to be a monster, a man who could laugh so hard you thought he might pass out and, in the same breath, put his hands around your throat. The fighting in the ring was fake. The blood outside it was always real. This is the story of how a professional wrestler became one of the most notorious figures in the Canadian underworld, a man who ran with 3 different criminal worlds in 3 different decades and left a trail of bombs, bodies, and betrayals from the steel mills of Hamilton to the gang war of Vancouver. And to understand the monster, you have to start with a terrified 5-year-old boy hiding under a steel bed frame, holding on with his fingertips so his father couldn't drag him out. East Hamilton, 1963. The steel mills belched smoke into the winter sky, coating the working-class city in a permanent grey. Into that world, a Romanian immigrant couple welcomed their youngest son, Ion William Croitoru. Born on the 7th of December, a boy dropped into a place where strength wasn't admired so much as required, where being hard was how you survived. And home taught him hard before the street ever did. By his family's own account, Christmas at the Croitoru house wasn't about presents. It was about a drunk, raging father who beat his wife and chased his children through the house with a broom. And it was about a 5-year-old boy who learned to fold his small body up under the steel frame of a bed and cling to it with his fingers and his feet, so that when the broom came stabbing underneath, it couldn't reach him. Want to know what forges a man who feels no fear? Start with a child who has already survived the worst thing in his own home. By the time the world got a look at Ion Croitoru, there was nothing left in it that could frighten him. Let me say one thing, and then I won't bring it up again. I have gathered everything you could possibly imagine about bikers and hidden secrets into this book. Available at my website, theinvestigator.com. If you want it, it is there. That is all. That is the engine underneath everything that follows, so hold on to it. Fear is what keeps most men inside the lines. Fear of pain, fear of prison, fear of death. Beat that out of a boy early enough, and you don't get a coward, and you don't get a hero. You get something more useful to dangerous people and more dangerous to everyone else. A man who will walk into the room everyone else is afraid of and do the thing everyone else won't. Hamilton, in those years, was the place to grow one. A hard steel city where the mills ran day and night, and the work was brutal, and the men were brutal to match. A town with a long, deep, organized crime history stitched right through its Italian neighborhoods. It was not a place that rewarded softness. Croitoru fit it like a fist fits brass knuckles. He grew fast, and he grew enormous. As a teenager, he practically lived in a Hamilton gym, a slab of muscle reportedly benching well over 600 pounds before he was out of his teens. 6 feet of granite with a bald head and bulging eyes, and a face that could stop a room. But the weights were only the warm-up. Between the sets, young Ion watched the neighborhood tough guys work the quiet handoffs in the dark corners of the gym, the envelopes changing hands, the older men who ran the streets swapping the currency of the Hamilton underworld. The same hands that could bend a steel bar were learning, in that gym, how to bend the law. He loved wrestling. But locally, long before any belt or any crowd, he was already known as something else. The tough kid from the wrong side of the tracks, the one you did not want to cross. The street became his first ring. He worked the door at Hamilton bars as a bouncer, and his reputation grew with every broken nose and every knocked-out tooth. Local hard men didn't just whisper his name, they physically crossed the street to avoid him. He had the size, he had the nerve, and he had the one thing you cannot teach, a genuine appetite for it. But there was a legitimate ring out there too, a place where a man could turn that same violence into cheers instead of fear, into money instead of jail time. Professional wrestling was calling. The problem, and it was the problem that would define his entire life, was that Ion Croitoru had already learned a different kind of performance in Hamilton's back alleys. The kind that didn't stop when a bell rang. While other young wrestlers were practicing how to fake being a bad guy, Kroitaru had a head start because he was already becoming one for real. And the gap between those two things, the performance and the reality, is the whole story. It just took him 30 years and 3 dead men to close it. His legend didn't begin in a wrestling ring. Fittingly, it began in the back of a police wagon. By his own telling, Kroitaru was working a bar one night, caught an assault charge, and got thrown into the back of a paddy wagon, and as they loaded him in, he looked up and saw the letters stenciled on the side of the dog unit's van. K9, that's the name. He decided right there, in handcuffs, because he was a dog. It was a perfect origin for the man he was building. His real training came in the early 1980s under 2 fellow Hamiltonians, and by 1984, he'd caught a wrestler's eye, working security at a Hamilton bar. That raw, dangerous presence carried him to Calgary and the legendary Stampede Wrestling, where Booker Bruce Hart took one look at the young bruiser and felt something worth putting on television. Hart first gave him a name that didn't stick Orhan Turgadan, the terrible Turk, but the one Kroitaru had been carrying in his back pocket since that police van fit him like brass knuckles in a street fight. Johnny K9. The wrestling road he traveled was the classic grind of a working heel, a bad guy for hire, moving from territory to territory. After a stint in prison in 1991 for assault, he resurfaced in a Michigan promotion billed as Taras Bulba. King of the chain matches in the Eastern Bloc, a completely invented Iron Curtain strongman gimmick, sharing cards with future legends like Mick Foley and Al Snow. Back home in Hamilton in the late 1980s, he even tried his hand at running the business himself, promoting a short-lived outfit called Canadian International Championship Wrestling. He was, in the language of the trade, over a genuine attraction wherever he landed, because there was something about him that read as real, even to audiences who knew the outcomes were scripted. In the World Wrestling Federation, he was a jobber, one of the men whose job is to lose on television to make the stars look good, and he wore the label without shame, because even losing on that stage, he commanded a strange respect. He was billed from Romania, a snarling animal the announcers loved to compare to a rabid dog. His signature moves told you everything about him: the stomach claw, a raw display of grip strength that left opponents gasping, and a flying headbutt that showed a genuine, frightening indifference to his own body. And here is the detail that tells you the line was already blurring. According to the people who worked with him, Kroitaru would tell his opponents, before a match, to hit him for real. He wanted blood. If there was no blood, he'd say, then they were doing the spot again until there was. That demand tells you everything about where the man was headed. For most wrestlers, blood was a tool used sparingly, a special effect earned for the biggest moments and otherwise avoided, because getting cut open for a living is a young man's mistake. For Kroitaru, blood was the point. He wanted the real thing in a fake fight, on purpose. It's the clearest early sign that the wall between performance and reality had already worn thin in him, that the ring wasn't a substitute for the violence he was capable of, but a place to indulge a taste for it in front of an approving crowd. The cheering was nice, the blood was necessary, and a man who needs the blood is a man who was always going to find his way, eventually, to the kind that doesn't wash off. Through the late 1980s, he shared the ring with legends: Pedro Morales, Tito Santana, Paul Orndorff, and the crowning television moment of that era came when he stood across the ring from Hulk Hogan himself, the biggest star on the planet, in front of a national audience. For a kid from the Hamilton Mills, it was the top of the mountain, but wrestling's paydays for a man in his role were thin, and Ion Kroitaru had already found a second income that paid far better. He just had to be willing to come home with blood on his shoes. Here is the cruel arithmetic that shaped his whole life. In the ring, the very best a man in his role could hope for was to be a memorable loser, respected over, but never the star, never the one holding the belt when the lights came up. The paychecks reflected it. Out on the street, the same body and the same menace that made him a good television monster made him an elite collector, and the numbers weren't close. A night's wrestling might pay a few $100s, a single afternoon of persuasion could pay thousands. So while the crowds cheered for Johnny K9, Ion Kroitaru was already doing the math, and the math pointed away from the ring. The wrestling was the dream, the crime was the income. And a man who feels no fear, who was raised to believe the world only respects force, does not spend long choosing the dream over the money. Because wrestling did not give him enough, and so he ventured into other businesses. The most reliable of them was collections, going to see the people you did not want to owe money to. Here is how it worked, and why he was so good at it. Someone was owed a debt they couldn't collect. They'd sign a percentage of that debt over to a man like Johnny K9, and he would go and get it, and keep his cut. And the reason it was so easy for him was, quite simply, his appearance. He didn't have to say much. A man built like a carnival strongman, with a face he could twist into something feral, standing in your doorway, is his own argument. He had acquaintances among the traditional organized crime families of Hamilton, most notably the Gravel family, a name that would come back to nearly destroy him a decade later. Sometimes he came home from a job with blood on his shoes and had to wash his hands at the sink. That was how he made his cash. The wrestling checks were fine, but blood money, he was learning, spent better. And Hamilton was the perfect place to learn that lesson, because Hamilton was, and is, one of the most mob-saturated cities in Canada, a steel town where traditional Italian crime families had run gambling, extortion, and loan sharking for generations, and where the lines between the old mafia and the newer outlaw biker world were porous. A man with Croix Toru's build and appetite was a natural free agent in that ecosystem. Not made, not a boss, but the kind of independent muscle every organization occasionally needs and nobody wants to become. He was learning the trade from the inside, who paid, who didn't, how fear got converted into cash, and how a reputation, once built, did most of the collecting for you. Every debt he squeezed made the next one easier, because word travels. By the time his wrestling career started to fade, Johnny K9 wasn't moonlighting as a criminal anymore. The wrestling was the moonlighting. Then, in 1994, wrestling gave him one last real shot at legitimacy, and for a moment he took it. After the WWF, opportunity had even come calling from across the Pacific. New Japan Pro Wrestling, one of the most prestigious promotions in the world, offered him fresh work and a fresh stage. But the shadows of his other life followed him everywhere, even to Japan, because a man cannot outrun what he is by changing continents. He only relocates it. He'd bounced through New Japan Pro Wrestling and a Michigan territory, but that year he landed in Smoky Mountain Wrestling, one of the last true old-school Southern territories in America, run by the sharp-tongued promoter Jim Cornette. Cornette took one look at the big bald man in the locker room, a guy who looked, in his words, like a turn-of-the-century carnival strongman. With the giant tattoo across his stomach and eyes, he could bulge on command and saw exactly what the WWF had wasted. A legitimate tough guy who could make an audience believe. Cornette rechristened him Bruiser Bedlam, and there's a detail from that era that captures the man perfectly. Rather than move south, Croix Toru drove down from Canada every single weekend in an open Jeep, in the dead of winter, without a shirt. Within months, Bruiser Bedlam was the promotion's Beat the Champ television champion. And then came the peak of his entire career, the night he pinned Macho Man Randy Savage, one of the biggest stars in the history of the business, 1, 2, 3, in the center of the ring. Savage, a former WWF champion, had come down to do the promotion a favor, and by Cornette's account, he offered the win to Croix Toru himself. For a jobber who'd spent years being pinned by the stars, it was the ultimate validation. "Here I am," the moment said. "I'm not that guy anymore." The Smoky Mountain run was the closest Ion Croix Toru ever came to be, and drew real heat from Southern crowds who'd never seen him before and had no idea the snarling animal in front of them moonlighted as a leg breaker back in Canada. He kept a punishing hardcore schedule everywhere he went. Barbed wire baseball bat matches against Ian Rotten, a bout with the notoriously violent New Jack, coal miner's glove, and steel cage wars that left him and his opponents genuinely bloodied. And that, more than the titles, was the tell. Other wrestlers protected themselves. Croix Toru went looking for the blood, demanded it, treated the fake fights as an outlet for something the fake fights could never fully satisfy. The ring gave him a stage for his violence. It could never be the violence itself, but the ring couldn't hold him because the ring was only ever rehearsal. He fought barbed wire baseball bat matches and coal miner's glove matches and steel cage wars, opened his own Bad Boys gym back in Burlington, and took the gold off veterans like Greg Valentine with brass knuckles flashing under the lights. And with every year, the line between the performance and the reality got thinner. The violence in the ring stopped feeling like acting and started feeling like practice. Because while Bruiser Bedlam was pinning Randy Savage in Tennessee, another organization back home had been watching the fading star, and they had a very different job in mind. They didn't recruit men, they selected them. And in 1995, the devil came calling for Johnny K9. By 1995, the wrestling checks weren't cutting it anymore, and the Satan's Choice Motorcycle Club, one of Canada's oldest and most feared outlaw biker gangs, saw an opportunity in the aging star. The offer, as it's been described, was for Croyterou to open up a chapter of Satan's Choice in Hamilton. He jumped at it, and he did not start at the bottom for long. He went from prospect to president, building out a Hamilton chapter, and, with it, a cocaine pipeline running down from the Hells Angels in Montreal, the same drug pipeline that would eventually help destroy him. The charisma that had worked wrestling crowds worked just as well on a different kind of crowd now. The money was staggering for the work involved, $20,000, $30,000 for 20 minutes, the kind of 20 minutes that left blood on your shoes. Because in that world, if you had Johnny K9 backing you, people paid, and people were scared, and scared people are profitable, and the cocaine made it bigger than muscle for hire. The pipeline running down from the Montreal Hells Angels turned his Hamilton chapter into a genuine distribution node, and that changed the scale of everything, the money, the stakes, and the danger. It also changed Croyterou. The men who watched him rise describe a specific transformation, the one that has ended 1,000 criminal careers. He went from, "I'm just a wrestler," to believing he was untouchable, a full-blown case of what one investigator called the Al Capone syndrome. Once a man climbs high enough in that world, and the money and the fear stack up around him, he starts to believe the rules bend to him, that he can do whatever he wants, wherever he wants, and no one can tell him no. It is a seductive, fatal delusion. And it was about to walk Johnny K9 straight into a strip club in Sudbury and dare the world to stop him. His clubhouse sat at 269 Lottridge Street in Hamilton, just 6 blocks from the headquarters of their bitter rivals, the Outlaws. Inside, there was a pool table, and that pool table was a gift from Pat Musitano, a boss of Hamilton's traditional Italian mob, a blessing from the old world of organized crime that carried its own weight in gold and, eventually, in blood. Understand what a leap this was. Satan's Choice was no small-time crew. It was one of the oldest and most notorious outlaw motorcycle clubs in Canadian history, a genuine power in the Ontario underworld with a decades-long pedigree of violence, drugs, and war with rivals. For a disgraced, aging jobber wrestler to be handed his own chapter and made president was extraordinary, and it happened for one simple reason. Croyterou brought exactly what an outlaw club values most. He brought fear, ready-made. He didn't have to build a reputation from nothing. He arrived with one, forged over a decade of collections and broken noses, amplified by a body that looked like it belonged on a poster. The club gave him structure, territory, and the protection of the patch. He gave them a walking weapon whose name alone moved money. It was a perfect, poisonous fit, and it went to his head fast. Watching all of it unfold was Detective Sergeant Len Isnor of the Ontario Provincial Police's Anti-Biker Enforcement Unit, a man who spent years studying Croyterou and came away with a simple read. You can tell who's genuinely cut out for that life and who isn't, and K9, for all his menace, had a fatal flaw. He loved to talk, especially about himself. In Isnor's blunt assessment, Croyterou was, in that specific way, stupid. And that flaw is the thread to pull, because it would eventually unravel everything. A man who loves the sound of his own voice, who cannot resist bragging about what he's done and who he is a gift to any investigator with a wiretap and patience. Isnor had both. But stupid or not, Croyterou was dangerous, and he was about to get more dangerous, because he'd formed an alliance with a man whose name even hardened criminals said only in a whisper, Michel Dubé, president of the Satan's Choice chapter up in Sudbury. You need to understand who Michel Dubé was, because Johnny K9 had hitched himself to something genuinely dark. Dubé wasn't a wrestler playing a monster, he was the real thing. Born in Sudbury in 1958, he'd risen to run the Satan's Choice chapter in that northern mining city, and the trail of bodies behind him was long and cold. According to one associate, Dubé had murdered a 13-year-old boy back in 1986 and staged it convincingly enough to pass as a suicide. He was the prime suspect in the 1988 killing of a childhood friend turned drug dealer, a man whose corpse was found shot in the forest outside Sudbury that October. This was the partner Kroitoru chose, and in December 1996, the two of them and their crews walked into a decision that would blow up both their lives, literally. That is worth pausing on, because it reveals something about where Johnny K9 had ended up. In the wrestling world, he'd been a performer playing a monster, a man who bled for a paycheck and drove home shirtless in an open Jeep. In Dubé, he'd found a real one, a man credibly linked to the killing of a child and the execution of a friend, a president who ran his northern chapter through genuine terror. Kroitoru had spent his life around violence, but there had always been a frame around it, the ropes of a ring, the rules of a collection, the understanding that it was, in some sense, business. Dubé operated with no frame at all, and when a man who plays a monster ties himself to a man who is one, the man who is one sets the terms. Kroitoru was about to learn that the hard way, standing in a strip club over something as small as a dress code. December 1996, the Solid Gold Strip Club on Falconbridge Road in Sudbury. A group of Satan's Choice members, Kroitoru among them, rolled up wearing their colors at the patches that announce a biker's allegiance. But the Solid Gold had a strict policy, no gang colors inside. The staff refused to serve them and asked them to leave. To most men, that's a minor annoyance. To Johnny K9, riding the high of what one investigator called the Al Capone syndrome, the belief, once you've climbed high enough in that world, that you can do whatever you want, it was an intolerable insult. When the other members started to fold up their colors and tuck them into their saddlebags, Kroitoru refused. "We're going to wear our colors in here," he insisted. The bikers dug in their heels, the staff held firm, and the Sudbury police were called, and a tense standoff played out between the Satan's Choice crew and the cops until, finally, the bikers backed down. They left, but they left humiliated. And you know what wounded pride does to dangerous men? It makes them reach for dynamite. That is the piece outsiders always struggle with, that a bomb, a police investigation, prison, and ultimately a friend's suicide could all trace back to a bouncer at a strip club saying, politely, that the gentlemen would have to remove their vests. But that is exactly how the outlaw world works, and exactly what the Al Capone syndrome does to a man's judgment. To Kroitoru, the refusal wasn't about a dress code, it was a public challenge to his authority, a crack in the aura of untouchability he'd spent years building, witnessed by his own crew. Backing down in front of the Sudbury police, folding up the colors and walking out was a humiliation he could not absorb, and men who have taught themselves that respect is the only currency and force the only way to earn it cannot let an insult stand. The response has to be bigger than the offense, always, or the fear that protects them starts to leak. So a strip club ejection didn't call for an argument. In the logic of that world, it called for a bomb. Before we get to the explosion that changed everything, one quick thing. If this is the kind of story you came for, the deep ones where the details matter, the subscribe button is how the next one finds you. Now, back to Sudbury. The plan, at first, was simple revenge. They would bomb the Solid Gold. In a Tim Hortons parking lot, where the highway meets Notre Dame Avenue, a package changed hands, just another coffee run. To anyone watching, Kroitoru and another member of the Hamilton group had offered to arrange the explosives. But somewhere between that coffee shop handoff and the execution, the plan changed. And this is the crucial part. It changed without Johnny K9 knowing. Michel Dubé had bigger, darker ideas than a strip club. Dubé decided the bomb wasn't going to the Solid Gold at all. He decided it was going to the Sudbury police station. On the 15th of December, 1996, someone planted the device in an alley beside police headquarters at the corner of Larch and Paris Streets in downtown Sudbury, and it detonated, blowing a hole clean through the brick wall of the building. Windows shattered for a block. One officer was injured. The damage ran to more than $130,000. Bombing a strip club over a colors dispute is outlaw biker logic. Bombing a police station is a declaration of war on the state, and it brought the full weight of that state down on Satan's Choice. And here's the detail that tells you Kroitoru genuinely didn't know. When the news broke, the police were listening on a wiretap, and Johnny's shock was completely real. "What do you mean the police station?" He can be heard saying it was supposed to be the Solid Gold. He'd helped arrange a bomb, and then watched, blindsided, as his partner redirected it into a crime 100 times worse. It didn't matter. His fingerprints, figuratively, were all over it. By 1997, the police were closing in on Satan's Choice from every direction: narcotics charges, extortion, collections, and now the bombing. And when the Hamilton Area Emergency Response Unit finally moved on Kroitoru's Lottridge Street clubhouse, they discovered just how seriously he took the threat of a raid. He had fortified the place like a bunker, barricading the doors so they couldn't be rammed, turning his clubhouse into a fortress. In the end, to get inside, police had to blow a hole in the wall of the building, the same crude solution that had started the whole affair. The man who'd helped bomb a police station had his own headquarters breached by an explosion. And the walls had been listening the whole time. This is where Len Isnor's read on him came due. For all his fortress doors and his barricades, Kroitoru had done the one thing that truly sinks a man. In that world he had talked, on the phone, on lines the police were recording. The genuine confusion in his voice when he learned the target had changed wasn't just a human moment, it was evidence, captured on tape, of a conspiracy he was part of. The police built their case out of exactly the material Kroitoru couldn't stop generating, his own words. Narcotics, extortion, the collections, and now a bombing that had escalated the whole file from organized crime to something the public and the courts could not ignore: a bomb at a police station in a Canadian city over a strip club insult. The pressure on Satan's Choice became total. Then Johnny K9 made the one mistake his world can never forgive. In the interrogation room, a skilled biker squad officer leaned on him with wiretap evidence and the right pressure, and Kroitoru, the man who loved to talk, talked. In his statement to police, he pointed the finger, naming Michel Dubé as the mastermind behind the police station bombing. It worked, in the narrow sense. Kroitoru was released on bail, and later handed a relatively light 33-month sentence when he was convicted in 1998. But in the outlaw world, there is one rule that sits above all the others, and it is absolute. You do not make statements to the police. You do not assist their investigation against your own, ever. And Johnny K9 had just done exactly that. When he came out of jail, Satan's Choice removed him from the club. He was branded the lowest thing a biker can be: a rat. His wife, Tracy, would later describe the fallout: a man yelling that her husband was a rat, and Tracy decking him for it. Police pulling her over not to charge her, but to warn her that there were hits out on both her and Johnny, that her life was in danger. The man who'd spent his life making others afraid was now the hunted one. And there is no coming back from that stamp. In the outlaw world, the rat label is not a suspension. It is a life sentence with no appeal, a brand that follows a man from city to city and club to club. It is the reason, years later and 3,000 miles away, that the Vancouver Hells Angels would take one look at his history and turn him away. Kroitoru had traded 33 months in a cell for a lifetime of exile from the only fraternity that had ever fully accepted him. He'd talked his way out of a longer sentence and, in doing so, talked himself out of the club, out of the protection, out of everything the patch had given him. Len Isnor's read had been exactly right. The flaw wasn't the muscle or the nerve, it was the mouth. It always had been. And his friend paid the ultimate price. Michel Dubé, named by Kroitoru, was facing not just the bombing, but 2 counts of first-degree murder from his long, bloody history. On the 22nd of September, 1998, alone in his jail cell, Michel Dubé hanged himself. He was 39 years old. And there's a terrible irony buried in that death, because by then, Kroitoru's own life had collapsed so completely that the friend he'd informed on was, in some tellings, the last real connection he had left to the world he'd built. Want to know the price of betrayal in the outlaw world? Sometimes it's paid in 33 months. Sometimes it's paid in a length of rope. But the biker chapter and the bombing were only the second act of Ion Kroitoru's criminal life. The police weren't done with him, and a far more serious accusation, a double execution in a quiet suburb, was waiting 6 years down the road. The 16th of November, 1998. an affluent, sleepy corner of Ancaster, just west of Hamilton. Before dawn, a neighbor heard a number of loud bangs. An old, beat-up car was seen driving away south in the dark, and in an upstairs bedroom of a home on Poston's Path, Lynn and Fred Gilbank lay dead, both shot with a shotgun. They were 52 years old, married for about 30 years, and their 27-year-old son found them. There was no forced entry, no robbery, no assault, nothing taken. This was not a break-in, this was an execution, and investigators quickly zeroed in on the likely reason. Lynn Gilbank was a criminal defense lawyer, and police believed she was the primary target, killed for her work specifically, for helping a client who had ratted out the Gravel family, the same Hamilton crime family Johnny K9 had run collections for, on drug offenses. Her husband Fred, police theorized, was murdered simply because he confronted the killers. Kill the lawyer who helped your enemies disappear into witness protection, and you send a message to every informant who might follow. For 6 years, though, that message had no return address. The Gilbank case became one of the most notorious unsolved murders in the Hamilton area. A respectable suburban couple, a lawyer and her husband, executed in their own home, with no robbery, no forced entry, no obvious suspect. Investigators poured years and, by some accounts, millions of dollars into it, and the theory they eventually built ran straight through the Hamilton underworld. Croyteru knew intimately that the drug-connected Gravel family had ordered the hit because Lynn Gilbank's client had informed on them, and that they had reached for a piece of freelance muscle. Everyone in that world knew the ex-wrestler biker, with a documented history of collections and violence for exactly those kinds of people. On paper, Johnny K9 was the obvious name. He had the reputation, the connections, and the willingness. What the police didn't have was proof, and their scramble to manufacture it would turn the case into a courtroom embarrassment. For 6 years, the case went cold. Then, in 2005, Hamilton police built a theory and made their move. They charged Andre Gravel, a man with a long record of drug offenses, with arranging the hit, and they charged Ion Croyteru, the ex-wrestler biker collector, as the man Gravel had hired to carry it out. It was a stunning accusation. Johnny K9, as a contract killer of a lawyer and her husband. Croyteru was hauled in, and he would spend 20 months behind bars awaiting a resolution. But the Crown's case had a fatal weakness, and it was one of the strangest pieces of evidence in Canadian legal history. The prosecution's theory leaned heavily on a surveillance video, taped the afternoon of the murders, that showed Gravel and Croyteru in conversation. There was no audio. So the police hired a British lip reader, paid handsomely, to decipher what the two men were supposedly saying to each other on that silent tape. Think about how much weight that put on one person's guesswork. A double murder, a 6-year investigation, the freedom of two men, all resting on a specialist reading lips off grainy surveillance footage of a conversation nobody could hear, and translating it into words a court could hang a case on. It was exotic, it was dramatic, and it was catastrophically fragile. The entire theory of the prosecution depended on trusting that this one reader had correctly divined a private conversation from silent video, and that her credentials were what she said they were. It fell apart spectacularly. At Gravel's bail hearing in 2005, one of the longest bail hearings in Canadian history, running 8 weeks, the lip reader's testimony was discredited when it emerged that she had misrepresented her own qualifications. Her reading of that silent video, the spine of the entire prosecution, could not be trusted. The judge concluded that the Crown's case rested on police work that was, in his words, less than strong, built on circumstantial evidence, and so it collapsed. In June 2006, the charges against Croyteru were withdrawn, no reasonable prospect of conviction. He walked. He would later say he couldn't sleep in that cell, that he couldn't believe he was locked up for something like this. The murders of Lynn and Fred Gilbank remain officially unsolved to this day, an open file with a standing reward. Whether Johnny K9 was a wrongly accused man or a killer, the system simply couldn't convict, is a question that died with him. But the collapse of that case didn't free him from the life. It just moved the life 3,000 miles west. Vancouver, mountains and ocean, and the promise of a genuine fresh start. Croyteru arrived on the west coast, and for a while, it looked like he might actually escape his own story. He worked security in the film industry, by his own accounts, guarding visiting stars, from Jack Nicholson to Cyndi Lauper, and even picked up bit parts as an actor, trading on the very menace that had defined his life. Was he a great actor? No. Was he a great actor? No. But he was having fun, and he was, for the first time in years, on the right side of the camera. His wife believed he was finally changing, but the streets have a way of calling their children home. The Hells Angels in Vancouver turned the aging, disgraced ex-wrestler away, no surprise, given the rat label that followed him. But another organization welcomed him with open arms, the United Nations Gang, a sprawling multi-ethnic crime syndicate led by a man named Clayton Ruesch, and Tracy watched it happen in real time. She'd catch him coming home from a North Vancouver gym, bragging that he'd been talking to the UN gang, and she'd think, wait a minute, we're going backwards. You're supposed to be changing your life. To grasp what he'd walked back into, you have to understand that late 2000s British Columbia was a war zone. The lower mainland Vancouver and the suburbs and the Fraser Valley beyond was being ripped apart by one of the bloodiest gang conflicts in Canadian history, a running battle over the multi-billion-dollar drug pipeline between the coast and the rest of North America. Public shootings, bodies in burning cars, innocent bystanders caught in the spray. On one side stood the United Nations Gang, deliberately built by Clayton Ruesch as a multi-ethnic alternative to the old white and Asian gang divides. On the other stood the Red Scorpions and the crew that had become the face of BC's underworld, the three Bacon brothers, Jonathan, Jamie, and Jared, young, brazen, and marked for death by half the province. This was not a fading Hamilton biker chapter squabbling over a strip club. This was a modern narco war with a body count, and Ian Croitoru, 50 years old, a washed-up wrestler, a disgraced ex-biker branded a rat on the other side of the country, had somehow talked his way onto the front line of it. The evidence of the backslide showed up in her own kitchen. Tracy has described finding 100 pounds of marijuana in their kitchen while their kids were at daycare, Johnny's bright new business. And the detail she tells is pure Croitoru. He wanted to spray the weed down with whiskey and Coca-Cola to make it weigh more, so they'd make more money. And there they'd be, spraying and bagging and weighing dope across the kitchen floor while he came home, stacking $20,000 and $30,000 at a time. He was, she told him, doing exactly what he'd done in Hamilton. And this time, the world he'd wandered back into was in the middle of an all-out war. That kitchen scene is the whole tragedy in miniature. Here was a man who had been handed a genuine second chance, a new city, legitimate work, a family that wanted him whole, standing over a pile of drying marijuana, scheming about how to pad the weight with whiskey and cola to squeeze out a few more dollars with his kids in daycare across town. He didn't slide back because he was broke, and he didn't slide back because he had no other options. He slid back because the life was the only place he'd ever felt like himself. The bragging at the gym, the stacks of cash, the flirtation with a gang at the center of a shooting war, it wasn't survival, it was appetite. The scared boy under the bed had spent 40 years turning himself into a man nothing could frighten, and a man nothing can frighten has no brakes. He doesn't know how to want a quiet life. He only knows how to want more. In the late 2000s, Metro Vancouver and the Fraser Valley were being torn apart by a gang conflict between the United Nations Gang and the Red Scorpions, the crew tied to three brothers who had become the most infamous name in British Columbia. Crime: Jonathan, Jamie, and Jared Bacon, the Bacon brothers. According to court records, the murder conspiracy began in January 2008 after UN leader Clayton Ruesch was shot at by a Bacon associate. Ruesch put a price on each of the Bacon brothers' heads, the bounty on Jamie Bacon alone climbing as high as $300,000. Johnny K9 had signed on with the side that was hunting the Bacons, and that hunt was about to kill an innocent man. The 9th of May, 2008, Kingsway, in Burnaby, just east of Vancouver. A 24-year-old stereo installer named Jonathan Barber was driving a Porsche Cayenne, a vehicle he'd just picked up to work on, an SUV that happened to be owned by the Bacons. To the gunman watching for their target, the car was the target. Wrong car, wrong man, wrong day to be behind that particular wheel. A hail of automatic gunfire ripped into the vehicle, killing Jonathan Barber where he sat. His girlfriend, 17 years old, driving in a car behind him, was wounded in the spray. Barber had no connection to gangs, to drugs, to any of it. He was a young man with a job, murdered because his vehicle looked like a gangster's. Another innocent life snuffed out on the edges of a war he had nothing to do with because Johnny K9 couldn't leave the life behind. Sit with Jonathan Barber for a moment because he is the truest victim in this entire story and the easiest to lose in the noise of wrestling belts and biker bombs. He was 24. He installed car stereos. He had a girlfriend and a future, and no idea that the SUV he'd picked up to work on carried a death sentence stitched to its license plate. The men hunting the Bacon brothers didn't check a face. They checked a vehicle, saw the shape they wanted, and emptied automatic weapons into it in traffic. In one sense, Croiteau didn't pull the trigger. The Crown itself would later concede it couldn't prove he was directly involved in the shooting. But he had signed on to the machine that produced it, the conspiracy that turned a stereo installer into collateral. That is the through line of his whole adult life. The violence he attached himself to never stayed neatly on its target. It splashed. It killed the wrong man in a car, an officer at a wall, a couple in a bedroom, a friend in a cell. Johnny K9 spent 30 years telling himself the blood was business. The blood never agreed. The law caught up in May 2009. Croiteau was arrested, along with several other UN gang members, and charged in connection with the conspiracy to kill the Bacon brothers. His wife was 9 months pregnant when they took him away, and she has said she didn't know it at the time, but the day he went into custody was the last day he would ever be a free man. That is the human wreckage the highlight reel leaves out. Somewhere behind the wrestling legend and the biker mythology was a family, a wife who kept believing he could change, children who would grow up visiting their father in institutions. Tracy had watched him claw toward a real life on the West Coast, and then watched him spray whiskey on marijuana across her kitchen floor, and now she watched, heavily pregnant. As the police walked him out of her life for good, he would meet the child she was carrying across a prison table. Every man in that world tells himself the risk is his to take. It never is. The bill for a life like Croiteau's always gets split with the people who love him, and they pay it long after he's gone. The case ground on for years under sweeping publication bans. And in July 2013, Ion Croiteau and 4 other UN gang members stood in a British Columbia courtroom and pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit the murders of the Bacon brothers and their associates. In exchange for those pleas, the Crown stayed the more serious charges of murder and attempted murder in the Barber shooting. Prosecutors said the evidence didn't establish that these particular men were directly involved in pulling the trigger on Jonathan Barber. The sentences ran from 11 to 14 years. Croiteau's share was in the range of 13. With credit for the years already served awaiting trial, he had under 5 years left to go. Jonathan Barber's father called the sentences unbelievably light and disturbing, and it's hard to argue with a grieving parent's math. A young man was dead, and the men who'd conspired in the war that killed him would be out in a handful of years. The mechanics of that outcome are their own quiet scandal. Because the 5 had been held for 4.5 years before their pleas arrested in 2009 and sentenced in 2013, they qualified under the old rules for enhanced credit for time already served, which meant a headline number like 13 or 14 years shrank, in practice, to a few years still to serve. So, the reality was starker than the sentence sounded. A conspiracy that had helped fuel a war and left an innocent 24-year-old dead in a hail of gunfire resolved for the men who pleaded to it into a manageable stretch of time with an exit date. For Ion Croiteau, it meant that the murder charge hanging over him simply evaporated in exchange for admitting to the conspiracy, and the clock on the rest of his life started ticking down. He had, once again, found the narrow gap between what he'd done and what the state could prove, and slipped through it. But this time, there would be no fresh start waiting on the other side. Prison, though, was never going to break Ion Croiteau. He'd been there before, more than once, and he did his time the way he used to work a long match, grinding it out, waiting for the bell. When his sentence wound down, only a single halfway house in all of Canada would agree to take him, the Keele Community Correctional Centre in Toronto, under strict conditions. No returning to Hamilton, the city that made him. No contact with criminals, the only world he'd ever really known. And in those final years, something quiet happened. He went back to the original Romanian spelling of his name, Croitoru, as if the aging man in the halfway house were trying to find his way back to who he'd been before Johnny K9, before Bruiser Bedlam, before the bombs and the bodies and the betrayals, before any of it. Picture the shape of that ending. A man who had once filled arenas and run a biker chapter and moved kilos of cocaine, now a 53-year-old on a tight leash in a single institution in Toronto, forbidden from the city that made him and forbidden from the only people he'd ever really known. No Hamilton, no criminals, no club, no crew, no ring. The conditions had stripped away every world he'd ever belonged to and left him alone with a name he'd spent 30 years running from. There is something almost gentle in the image of him, quietly restoring the spelling his parents gave him, as close as a man like that ever comes to an apology. But it was too late for reinvention. The body had absorbed too much, and whatever finally reached into that room and stopped his heart didn't care what name he was going by. He never made it back. On the 21st of February 2017, staff found Ion Croitoru dead in his room at the halfway house. He was 53 years old, and he was supposed to travel back to Vancouver to see his family in just 6 weeks. Instead, the police came to Tracy's door and told her that Ion had passed away that morning, and she went numb. The official cause was a heart attack, a body worn down, they said, by a hard life. But in the world Croitoru lived in, few deaths are ever that simple, and the theories multiplied immediately. Some wondered whether it was a hot shot, a deliberately lethal dose slipped to a man someone wanted gone, a man who'd made enemies on the West Coast and had a lifelong habit of knowing too much and talking too freely. His wife Tracy offered another explanation entirely, that prison guards had once maced him so badly his lungs were permanently damaged that they'd had to scrape his lungs, and that the damage finally caught up with him. Heart attack, hot shot, or the slow rot of a body that had absorbed too much punishment, the truth went into the ground with him. As someone put it to Tracy afterward, in a grim headline, natural causes succeeded where mobsters and gangsters had failed. In death, Ion Croitoru became something he'd never quite managed in life, a legend people could agree to enjoy. His story got told and retold, eventually anchoring an episode of the true crime wrestling series that dug into the sport's darkest corners, and in the telling, he took on the shape of a folk hero, a Canadian Al Capone, the wrestler who lived a double life wild enough to seem invented. His old colleagues from the locker room remembered a funny, larger-than-life character, a guy who drove shirtless through blizzards and laughed until he nearly passed out. But the men who'd worked the other side of his life saw someone very different. Len Isnor, the detective who'd studied him for years, flatly rejected the folk hero softening. Croitoru, he maintained, was a genuinely dangerous individual, and Isnor did not doubt he'd been involved in homicide. And there is the whole problem of the man in a single split screen. Ask the wrestlers who shared a ring with him, and Johnny K9 was a good guy. Ask the family of Jonathan Barber or the children of Lynn and Fred Gilbank, and you would get a very different answer. Wrestling, one of his peers said, is subjective. So, it turns out, was Ion Croitoru. Look at the whole arc, and the sheer strangeness of it never quite fades. 3 names for one man, Johnny K9, Bruiser Bedlam, Ion Croitoru, and each one a different life. The jobber who lost to the Stars and then pinned Randy Savage. The biker president who fortified a clubhouse 6 blocks from his enemies and helped set a bomb that tore open a police station. The West Coast gangster spraying whiskey on marijuana in his own kitchen while his kids were at daycare, tangled in a war that gunned down an innocent stereo installer. He wrestled Hulk Hogan on national television, and 7 years later, he blew a hole in a police station. He protected movie stars by day, in the end, and had run murders and collections by night. And the bodies that trailed him tell their own grim story. Jonathan Barber, a 24-year-old, killed for driving the wrong car. Michel Dubé, dead by his own hand in a cell after Croitoru named him. Lynn and Fred Gilbank, executed in their own bedroom in a case that named Johnny K9 and then fell apart, still unsolved. Whether he was the hand behind all of it or a man the law could never quite convict, the deaths gathered around him like smoke around a fire. And smoke, in the end, was where he began a boy born under the grey haze of the Hamilton Mills, who never did find his way back out from under it. Now remember the 5-year-old boy under the steel bed frame, holding on with his fingertips so his father couldn't reach him with the broom. He built himself out of that fear into something enormous, 6 feet of muscle, a face that emptied rooms, a man 3 criminal worlds wanted on their side. He made himself bigger than the terror he was born into. He also made himself into something far worse than the man who terrorized him. The wrestling ring couldn't contain him. The streets couldn't kill him. 4 separate stints behind bars couldn't reform him. And in the end, after the wrestling checks and the biker patch and the gang war, after the bombs and the collections and the trail of dead, it wasn't a rival or a bullet or a hotshot that finally stopped Ion Kreuteru. It was a failing heart in a halfway house room, in a body that had carried far more weight than the 600-odd pounds he used to press the weight of every life that ended in his orbit. Hauled all the way to an unremarkable grave. He left behind 3 children, a widow who still maintains his innocence, and a scattering of victims and families who will never call him a folk hero. So here's the question worth sitting with, the one the wrestlers who liked him and the cops who hunted him could never agree on. Was Ion Kreuteru a genuinely dangerous killer who spent his whole life one lucky break ahead of the reckoning he deserved, or a broken, terrified kid from a Hamilton steel town who was never given a real chance to be anything but a monster? Drop where you land in the comments. And if you want the next story like this one, the kind where the truth cuts deeper than any fiction, subscribe and stay for the ride. In the ring, every story ends with a fall and a chance at redemption. This wasn't the ring, and for Johnny K9, the bell has rung for the last time.